Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. Let me introduce you to today's guest. Fred Hochberg is a businessman and civic leader whose sterling credentials include multiple terms as chair and president of the Export-Import Bank. In fact, Fred is the institution's longest-serving chairman. He was also president of the Lillian Vernon Corporation, which was famously founded at the kitchen table by Fred's mother the year before of his birth. And Forbes described the company as one of the great success stories of American entrepreneurship. And you may be interested to find out that very kitchen table is at the Smithsonian. Fred served in both the Clinton and Obama administrations and has been active in LGBTQ causes for decades. In the 1990s, he served as co-chair of the board of the Human Rights Campaign, the largest LGBTQ civil rights organization, advocacy organization in the United States. And I also should mention, among those many credentials, that Fred is a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow and the author of the book, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. And a little bonus viewing for you, if you come to wilsoncenter.org, a couple months ago, Fred did a book event about that new book when it was released, and that's available at the Wilson Center website. Also joining us is Alex Long. My colleague is a Wilson Center Program Associate with the Science, Technology, and Innovation Program. He also serves as chair of the LGBTQI plus Employee Resource Group as part of the Wilson Center's Diversity and Inclusion Council. And just a few days ago, I'm happy to say, the organization's Out in Foreign Policy in New America named Alex one of its 15 LGBTQIA plus new voices in national security and foreign policy. Congratulations on that, Alex, and welcome, Fred.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
Let me, I plugged your book, Fred, and I made a note to myself to not forget to do that. So now we'll switch gears and talk about our topic of the day, which is advocacy around LGBTQ issues. And if you would, take us back in time to when you were a young man starting out in your career and give us a sense of what the environment was like at that time.
You know, it was a pretty terrifying time to be in high school. You know, I was the last all-male class of a prep school in Westchester County. You know, sports and being a jock was sort of number one. And so if you weren't a jock and you weren't straight and you weren't, frankly, heterosexual Christian male, you were sort of on the outs. And so that was not a great time. So if I do look back, just in my own lifetime over the, hard to believe, 50 years, it's been enormous progress. It's been enormous progress. The fact that we're doing this today, the fact that presidential candidates and presidents from Bill Clinton onward have made the LGBTQ community part of a coalition, part of a governing majority. That is still staggering progress, albeit in 50 years. It's probably some of the fastest progress we've seen when we think about African Americans. We're talking about Juneteenth, women, immigrants. The LGBTQ community has actually made enormous progress in a relatively short period of time when you consider history.
When I want to ask you sort of the Spider-Man question, you know, with great power must also come great responsibility. How much did your personal experience fuel your professional activism?
Well, I think it certainly did. I mean, my family, at least on both sides, but on my mother's side, left Germany in 1933. They first moved to Holland, to Amsterdam, sort of as a staging area to decide where they might go, knowing they had to leave Europe, and looked at Palestine, looked at Cuba, and settled on New York. So I think growing up in that environment about where a sense of civil rights, a personal liberty, religious freedom, you get spoon-fed that at the dinner table. And that becomes part of a family's lore. So I think that from that point of view, that certainly infused my sense of advocacy in the area of LGBTQ issues. And I think that had a lot to do with it.
It's amazing how much dynamism and then action came from that immigrant experience that you described, in particularly that moment in time in that place in America. Alex, over to you.
Yeah, so And Fred, thank you so much for being with us today. And John, thanks so much for having me. I guess one of my biggest questions as someone who is queer and is, quote, a new voice, someone who is coming up, I was interested in knowing your history with navigating through government as a queer person, as a gay person. And I know, and it's, we are of different generations. So I call myself queer, and that used to be absolutely a non-starter term. So we have come so far, but we obviously still have yet to go. And I was wondering, again, where your queerness, your gayness intersected with your professional life in potentially a way that kind of was fraught and something that has always stuck out to you.
Well, partly, at my generation, we all have coming out stories. The younger people today, first of all, come out much younger, to the extent they even have to come out, that it's even an event. People my age and somewhat younger, all have a coming out story about how they came out to friends, how they came out at school, how they came out to their parents. And that all is a moment of personal courage, of looking at yourself and understanding who you are and how you want to operate in the world. So that, I think one of the great strides we've made is it's not a non-issue, it's less of an issue. There are many places in this country where that's still an issue. And I think we've seen, regrettably, this has been, I'm going to put the period that Donald Trump was president, but it's certainly leading up to the Trump presidency, some of the best times for LGBTQ people in America in terms of acceptance, in terms of laws being passed. And most recently, last June, the Supreme Court ruling on job discrimination, something I've worked on, good Lord, I don't know, 40 years or so. And I now can say it without choking up, but I had a hard time talking about that without really feeling just emotionally frozen by it. And yet at the same time, and particularly looking at the Wilson Center, the rest of the world has been rather horrific. Sub-Saharan Africa has been terrible. Many places in the Mideast are horrendous. I was listening to Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation today. There are 80 countries where the penalty for being openly LGBTQ is death. I mean, so we have to sort of square those two realities that are very, very different today than, and probably we're better informed than we were years ago.
And to piggyback off of that, I mean, also just today, the Supreme Court just ruled in favor of a Catholic group for denying gay parents the ability to adopt. And so the issues persist. And I'm wondering, through your extensive advocacy and your continued advocacy, where your mind is next and where you see as the next big issue, because we're both white and queer men. So we have a certain amount of responsibility to uplift those who are not so lucky to also be white and man. So I'm wondering where your next efforts you see yourself playing in.
Well, I think I would say I see that when I think about LGBTQ rights, I think that I'd like to think of them in a broaden the context to think about civil rights in general, voting rights, and not keep it as narrow. And I think that as our community has made such progress over that time, we've become more part of the broad spectrum of looking at civil rights and voting rights as an integrated part. And as I mentioned earlier, partly looking at the rights of gay people outside the United States. One thing when I served in the government, and as you mentioned, I was at the Export-Import Bank for 8 years. When I traveled abroad, in addition to my duties in looking at furthering U.S. exports, I noticed there were two groups of people I hardly ever saw initially, and that was LGBT people and women. So when I would travel, I asked each embassy, I said, I want to meet with the queer community, and I'd also like to make sure I meet with the women's community. And I will tell you, I remember a trip to Mozambique. We had a new ambassador, and he was installed like on a Tuesday. I got there Thursday. And as a result, his first official meeting was with the gay community in Mozambique. That sent a really strong message to the embassy staff and the government of Mozambique, because they obviously know whenever the ambassador does anything. So those are really strong statements of the importance of that and how we as Americans valued their civil rights and their right to operate and to live their lives openly in those countries. We have enormous power of that example. And it's something that we need to continue to use.
Speaking of examples, what are your thoughts on the role popular culture or soft power plays in this equation? I mean, we've certainly seen dramatic changes in media, entertainment media over the years. Is that almost as important as what takes place in the halls of Congress or in the Supreme Court or other official places?
Without question. I mean, sometimes legislation and politics leads. It frequently follows. It frequently follows the culture. Sometimes it leads in it can lead in more likely in a court decision than it might lead in legislation, because legislation's got to be passed by the House and the Senate. So certainly popular culture had a lot to do with it. Everything from Rock Hudson in the 80s, dying of HIV, movies like Philadelphia, and there are more examples than I could probably recount specifically. You know, Bill Clinton was the first president that I can really think about that wanted and sort of made an outreach to the gay community, the LGBTQ community, as part of a winning strategy for his election. Now, I'm a big fan of Bill Clinton, but I know there are a lot of people who are disappointed in a number of things that happened for our community under the Clinton administration. But he still was the first one to actually put it front and center. And I think he believed it. I think he believed it. You know, and there are other heroes like Senator Chuck Robb, who was one of the early supporters in the Senate. And partly he served in the Navy. He was Lyndon Johnson's son-in-law. And I remember I meant to meet with him and he went like, of course they're gay people in the Navy. And it was like a shoulder shrug. It's like, I don't understand what the issue is. And that was a very powerful support for gay people at the time when we were trying to integrate the military in 1993, 94. It did take 17 years to 2010, but again, that feels like a long time, but in the course of history, that's faster than many other civil rights have been gained.
In that regard, you know, what are your thoughts on patience as it relates to progress? In the sense that, you know, when you say some people were happy with as much as President Clinton did, but others not as much, as someone who's been in a public figure and been in official government capacities, how important is it to bring people along, I should say, at a pace that they can manage?
Well, I think that's a very key thing, that you can only introduce change to an organization, a company, a university, a country at a pace in which it can accept it. If you go too fast, you leave people on the sidelines. If you go too slow, you get mired in the muck and you never get it done. So you need both. And frankly, I think the civil rights of the LGBTQ community has been helped by both, by the impatience, a lot of it around HIV and AIDS, and then there are moderating forces that try and move those issues forward and get clarity and get legislation passed. So both are important. Too much patience and nothing happens. And on the other hand, victories beget victories. You know, I was disappointed, but I understood in 2004, there was a vote on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act to try and ban employment discrimination. And at that time, it did not include trans rights. And the bill went down because the far left and the far right both formed a coalition to kill it. And I remember Stephanie Tubbs Jones, a prominent African-American congresswoman who was a good friend from Cleveland, she said, I don't understand the gay community. This is progress. It's not perfect, but you know, progress for African Americans and Blacks have never been perfect, and it's always got to be better. We passed on that. It took another 16 years to get a Supreme Court to rule. And now we're still trying. Now, obviously, we'd like to get that passed into law, because we've also learned Supreme Court rulings are good, but they can be fragile. And passing a law is far more resilient than any Supreme Court ruling. So, we need both. Maybe it's because I've been around. I can see the progress, but I also can be impatient about it. I also can have a great impatience about it. And, I had an incident as we're talking, when I got to the new school. I was a dean there, and they had domestic policy health insurance. This was before there was gay marriage, and it was early 2000s. And they said to me, however, when you leave the new school, COBRA, which is the sort of allows you to keep your health insurance for at least 6 months after you leave a job so that people have continuity, you can have your health insurance, but your partner can't. And I remember I looked at them and I said, you really hate gay people that much that you would do that? And they changed the policy. And that's how, that was a small thing, but we changed the university looked at it and said, that's wrong. We got to change our policy. So I remember that story as we're talking, but partly we need impatience. And frankly, every one of us can do something to move progress, to move our organizations, to move family and friends, relatives. I think we all actually can play an active role in doing something.
I'm guessing both of you saw in the last week or so the results of a poll that for the first time since such polls were taken, 55%, a majority of Republicans support same-sex marriage. And that was the first time in these polls that it happened, even though a significant percentage of Americans overall support it. And I'm wondering, does that put some wind in your sails? Do you think, even though, as you mentioned, Fred, 4 years of the Trump administration saw some backtracking in terms of tolerance, not just on these issues, but across the board, and yet America seems to be changing?
And yet, at the same time, when the Equality Act came up in Congress, not one Republican voted for it in the House.
So those are the elected officials, not the people.
So we often have a disconnect between elected officials and their constituents. I happen to live in Miami Beach. Donna Shalala had been the congresswoman. She was replaced by a Republican who won the seat, Maria Salazar. And there's a large concentration of LGBTQ people in the Miami Beach area, and she voted against it. So she didn't vote. She didn't vote with her community. She voted with sort of what the national Republican party platform is. And I think one of the challenges as we talk is that in some ways our politics have become so national that sometimes members of Congress or senators aren't really thinking about their community and who they're representing, but their party affiliation.
Earlier, you mentioned small victories, and I know that you have been in government in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and I mean, personally, I love hearing these stories, but I would love to hear about one of the big victories that you were a part of and kind of being in the room when it happened and how that felt.
Oh God, that's a good question, John. Well, I mean, again, I guess my immediate thought goes to the most recent Supreme Court ruling of a year ago this month, in fact, only in that I had worked on the issue of permitting openly gay people, lesbians, to serve in the military in 1993. And we then moved on and we got members of Congress to sign a letter that they would not discriminate in the hiring in their office. And then once we did that, we tried to move forward on the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So those are each small steps in moving us down that path. And frankly, that was at a time before the rights of trans people were recognized as an issue. So that progress has been slow and iterative. I remember specifically meeting with Ted Kennedy, who had been one of the most extraordinary advocates and eloquent advocates and effective advocates for LGBTQ people. And he initially had some challenges with including trans as part of an employment bill. And just I was with him, and he said to me, he pulls me aside, he goes, "Fred, I'm having a lot of trouble understanding these trisexuals." And I said, "No, Senator, they're not trisexuals. They're called transgender." And I only recognized that as this was about 2004. And partly, here was a guy who was on the forefront of civil rights, and he was just trying to get his head around these things, and they're challenging. So I feel, and the other thing, I guess, Alex, I'll give you another, you asked me for some other examples. I remember meeting with Martin Frost, who was a congressman from Texas, who was running the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And I was active in the Human Rights Campaign at the time. And I went to Martin Frost. I saw him. I bumped into him in the hallway. And I said, "Congressman, now that you're running the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, I think it's important that you support LGBTQ rights, you support the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, because you're in a leadership position, and so much of the caucus is with us." And I got a very sort of frosty, curt turned on his heels and walked away. And I remember going back to the Human Rights Campaign and saying, "Well, I met with Martin Frost. We bumped into each other." I said, "I got a really frosty, pun intended, response." So that's 2003. No, that's, yeah, I don't know. I can't remember. It's late 90s, I believe. I run into Martin Frost in 2016. And I get emotional talking to you.
Okay, take a moment.
He remembered that conversation, and he thanked me. And I felt I had done something. And the fact that we were at a dinner with 20 people, and that he came over to where I was sitting and told me that story, I thought, okay, we all can make an impact. And I feel I've been very blessed, as you said, Alex. I'm a white male, and I've been able to participate in government and in politics. And with that, I have felt an obligation to do something with that. Not just to go to a dinner, but to actually push it. I remember pushing George W. Bush I was at a dinner, and at something called the Gridiron Dinner. And I got introduced to him, and he was feeling very safe. Everybody's in white tie and everything else. And I went up to him and I said, "Mr. President," said, "we're trying to pass the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And I hope when it comes to your desk, you will sign it, because it's the right thing to do." So I felt over time, when you ask in the room, I felt whenever I'm in the room and had a chance, I had to do something about it. And that included when I was with the Export Import Bank, and frankly, visited countries like Saudi Arabia and so forth. I had to do the same thing.
Yeah, and I think a little follow-up, and thank you so much for sharing that story. I mean, I know these things can get emotional, and I have a couple of similar experiences, which truly just hit so close to home when you're able to illuminate a whole nother world to someone, because so much of pride is visibility. And I do understand that some people get bogged down by the fact it's not just like putting up a rainbow logo. But while it is not just that, there is something powerful about just being like out and queer and talking like I do and saying the things and advocating for these issues, because you could teach someone that, gay people, LGBTQI people are all around them at all times. And I really appreciate that. And I think if I could ask just one more follow-up
Sure.
On that, again, as someone who is getting into this world and hoping to make even a smidgen of an impact as much as you have, I'm wondering, you got into politics, you got into this world almost in spite of politics itself. Like there's not a very easy place to just jump into. And I was wondering your mental calculus about going into the lion's den, so to speak, on these issues, when it may have been easier not to, and it may have been more welcoming to go into another space. So,
I think about a period, I'll call it PSPA, post-Stonewall pre-AIDS. It's sort of 69 to 80, where there was a sense of liberation and acceptance, and yet so many laws, whether it's renting an apartment or getting a job, that were denied to openly gay people, and people still had to live secretively, describe what they did on a weekend with blurred pronouns and everything else, as a period of a lot of excitement in terms of what was potential. And I remember feeling at the time, I wanted to sort of move the body politic and not just, set up something that helped a community center, that was local. Both are important. I just know what was more compelling to me and the kind of where I felt I could have an impact. And I was in a business, I was in business for 20 plus years that was not terribly gay friendly, I moved the company I was running, Lillian Vernon, from the New York metro area to Virginia Beach. We were 10 miles from Pat Robertson and Christian Broadcasting Network. It was a very different place. And so I may come home on the weekend to Manhattan, to Greenwich Village, but I spent a week often in Virginia Beach. I was really straddling two very different worlds and trying to sort of, how do you navigate that? And how do you, what's the right approach forward? And partly, sometimes it's making people uncomfortable, and sometimes it's making people comfortable, to the extent that when you mention the thing that 55% of Republicans now support same-sex marriage, I mean, they have seen enough couples, same-sex couples, they go, they're as nice or as horrible as all other neighbors. They're no better and they're no worse. And so that familiarity has, I think, helped move this thing forward. And, if you think about, for many years, the issues for politics was sort of guns, gays, and choice. The community we're talking about, LGBT community, in some ways has had a faster or easier time making progress than we have on things like choice and a woman's right to choose, as we're seeing right now coming up in the Supreme Court, and on guns. And we've seen some horrific gun violence, particularly as we emerge out of COVID. So that makes me optimistic, but it also makes me impatient. And but we have to do it in a way that brings people along and doesn't sort of shame people who aren't there yet. We have to sort of find a way to get them there.
Fred,
I don't mind shaming politicians. I'm just regular people.
Well, when they deserve it, right? I make notes to myself throughout interviews, and I jotted down advice to next generation. And then Alex just asked you the question he did. And frankly, you've been providing advice throughout the interview, just through your stories, your example, and your words of wisdom. So I have a different sort of final question, which is under that category. And it's about optimism versus pessimism. You talk about patience versus impatience. But how do you navigate that field? How do you go from celebrating a terrific achievement or a great moment of change and then becoming despondent or discouraged when things turn the other way? You've been at this game for a while, as you've mentioned. How do you maintain an even keel?
Well, I guess I'm still optimistic. I'm optimistic, as I said. I don't want to keep hearkening back to last June, but that was a giant step forward. And John, I have to say, when you said exit question, I thought about, I once sat on a plane next to John McLaughlin, who used to have the McLaughlin Report. And we had a long talk about LGBT issues, about same-sex marriage. And he was all there. He was sort of that old line conservative, had, no problem with it whatsoever. We sat together for 3 hours on a flight to Florida. And as men of his generations, and we get off the plane, he goes, I got to go hit the can. So I just said, and I used my John McLaughlin voice, I said, bye-bye. Alex, you may have missed that show. It was one of the forerunners of the Sunday shows.
It was black and white television, Alex.
It was,
before your
but it
time.
was very good. So I think that I see, certain progress. Keep telling you stories. In 1992, I was part of a delegation led by Barney Frank to Russia when they were rewriting their constitution. And we got them to actually decriminalize homosexuality. Interestingly, lesbian was not a criminal offense because, frankly, in their own male view, they did not understand two women. That was just like a concept they couldn't get. So that was not illegal, but amongst two men it was. And we were advocates. There were about a dozen of us. They decriminalized it. Now, under Putin, he has torqued that and changed it and manipulated that in a very different way. But originally, it was in their constitution. It was in the Constitution of South Africa. And those are things that did give me hope that there were other countries that are actually leading us. So I guess, partly we made some progress. We often step backwards, but I guess I look over when I was a little kid and what it was and how terrifying it was to think of myself as a gay person and where that is today. And they were having this conversation that I remember when we tried to pass end of first time in Congress. And I remember I was outside the Senate chambers and I'm listening to people like Chris Dodd and Chuck Robb speaking in the Senate, talking about the rights of in those days was gay and lesbian. And I thought, it was unimaginable that those words would come out of political leaders in our country. So we've made progress. I would wish we made more progress, faster progress, but we've just elected Joe Biden president. We elected Kamala Harris as vice president, a woman of color with Jamaican and Indian parents. We're getting there. It's slowly. We go forward, we go backwards. We're pretty resilient as a people and as a country, and it's important. I would say one thing. This struggle was important for my own self-esteem. This struggle was important for me to feel like I have to do something and not be a victim. And so I think that my work on advocacy and on LGBTQ issues was partly about a personal journey of having getting to a different sense of self-esteem and feeling good about that and centered around that. And that was an important ingredient for me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing so much with us today. Speaking of pride, Fred, we're proud to have hosted you at the center to write your book, and we're very grateful that you could help us celebrate Pride Month with your appearance today. Alex, thank you as well. Your perspective and input is terrific, and we really appreciate the leadership you're providing within the Wilson Center.
Thanks so much, John. It really means a lot. And let me extend my thanks to Fred as well. Truly just such an amazing conversation. And I want that book to be written, by the way. So
well, I want to thank the two of you because this conversation went in directions and places I never imagined when we started a little while ago. So thank you both for moving.
And you still say it was a pleasure to meet us after.
It was a total pleasure to meet you. And I look forward to doing it in person when we all can.
I very much look forward to that.
I'll hold you to that, Fred.
Yes. Thank you very much, both of you.
We
hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.